Welcome to FFRS Ask an Atheist on Facebook Live, where we answer common questions about atheism, freethinkers, and state-church separation. I'm Annie Laurie Gaylor, co-founder and co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces this weekly show.
And I'm Andrew Seidel, FFRF's Director of Strategic Response. Today we're going to talk about the bombshell grand jury report on abuse and cover-ups in the Catholic Church, which the Pennsylvania Supreme Court released last week. FFRF has been monitoring clergy sexual crimes against minors since 1986. We began running our monthly column Black Collar Crimes in 1987 in FFRF's monthly newspaper Free Thought Today. And FFRF published the first book about clergy sexual abuse called Betrayal of Trust, Clergy Abuse of Children in 1988, written by my co-host, Annie Laurie Gaylor. 30 years ago, and it seems like we're still in the same spot.
While these crimes are not limited to the Roman Catholic Church, this church is disproportionately represented by offending clergy engaging in collusion and cover-up on an international level. As whistleblower and Catholic attorney Reverend Thomas Doyle warned way back in 1987, the Catholic Church appears to be, I think it is, an organization preaching morality and providing sanctuary to perverts.
Now, the numbers from this report in just one state are sobering. 300 priests, 1,000 victims, 1,400 pages. And
notably, Andrew, no indictments of any bishops.
No indictments, but 2 million documents reviewed, including many from a previously unknown secret archives of abuse that the church maintains. And this report only encompasses 6 of the 8 dioceses in Pennsylvania. And since it was released, another 400 victims have contacted investigators.
The Pennsylvania Attorney General Josh Shapiro announced the report, and here's part of what he said.
The unprecedented scope of this investigation, the abuse, diocese by diocese, charges resulting from this grand jury investigation, the systematic cover-up by church leaders, the weaponization of faith, the failure of law enforcement, and finally, the recommendations of the grand jury. The grand jury investigated 6 dioceses: Allentown, Harrisburg, Pittsburgh, Greensburg, Erie, and Scranton. Their work built on previous grand jury investigations into the Diocese of Philadelphia and Altoona, Johnstown, and paints a complete picture of abuse and cover-up in every diocese in Pennsylvania. The grand jury investigation began about 2 years ago because we realized during the Altoona, Johnstown investigation that the abuse and cover-up was not just limited to that region, but it was pervasive throughout the entire Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Dozens of witnesses testified before the grand jury, detailing acts of sexual abuse by priests and how senior church officials covered up their criminal conduct, prioritizing their institution over the safety and welfare of these young boys and girls.
Now, the detail in this report, which is, again, supported by those documents from the secret archives, is harrowing. It was hard to read, and we aren't going to recite much of it here, but you need to get a feel for some of the awful crimes it cataloged. For instance, one priest abused 5 sisters and collected girls' quote, urine, pubic hair, and menstrual blood.
Another priest raped a girl, got her pregnant, and, quote, procured an abortion. The bishop who was aware of this wrote a letter saying, "I share your grief." The problem was he was writing this letter to the priest and not the victim. According to the report, the church documentation seemed to exclusively address the abortion with little concern for the fact that the priest had impregnated a child and broken the law.
One priest dragged the boy across a living room floor, pulling him by the underwear, then beat the victim repeatedly, once using a metal cross. Priests in one diocese essentially ran a child porn ring. In another, a group of predatory priests marked compliant victims with golden crosses. I mean, you can turn to any page in this report and the horror just jumps out at you. I flipped to page 46 this morning preparing for this, and a victim tells of a particularly violent rape that he suffered. He then goes on to say, quote, "Father Gruff did more to me than rape me. He killed my potential, and in doing so, killed the man I should have become." And of course, there's the 7-stage playbook for covering up this abuse. Now, Annie Laurie, you published the first book on this 30 years ago, and it seems like really nothing has changed.
It's the first nonfiction book, and the shorter answer to you, Andrew, is of course yes. In some senses, nothing has changed. And I'd like to give a little bit of background. Back in '88, when Betrayal of Trust was published, I included a chapter, Who Monitors the Clergy?, pointing out there are about 185 Catholic dioceses and archdioceses in the United States. Then there were about 53,000 priests. Now, in the late 1980s, the whistleblower, Thomas Doyle, that we mentioned before, estimated as many as 3,000 priests could be pedophiles. And that math works out to 1 out of 18 priests, or an average of 16 per diocese. So let that sink in. And if the average pedophile priest molests 50 children, which is probably conservative, even if the problem had been confined to those 200 or 300 priests that had been identified in the 80s, we'd now have as many as 10 to 15,000 victims. Now, there are actually 300 priests named in one part of one state. So we know that this is a trail of devastation. If Doyle were correct and there were actually at least 3,000 such priests, the number of priests would be 10 to 15 times greater. And so we need to update those figures a little bit.
Yes, we do need to update those figures, and we've actually looked at some of those. The Catholic figures show that about 4% of priests and deacons serving in the U.S. between 1950 and 2002 had been accused of sexual abuse of someone under the age of 18. By 2014, the Vatican had defrocked about 848 priests who raped or molested children, and then sanctioned another 2,572 with lesser penalties. It had handled more than 2,400 cases of abuse reported to the Vatican since 2004. And you'll remember that the UN committees, including the Committee on the UN Treaty Against Torture, forced the revelation of those figures. Now, Pope Francis in 2014 claimed that only about 2% of Roman Catholic clergy worldwide, that's about 8,000 people, are pedophiles.
And we do consider that to be very conservative.
Yeah, the other figures are as high as 6% in some cases.
And I saw that 6% figure way back in the 80s.
Yeah.
So in terms of also saying, have things changed, what has changed is that we finally have had some bishops arrested, convicted, as well as defrocked. We've also seen a great deal of cover-up. Bringing them into the Vatican in some instances. But that had not happened in the 80s. But look how long it's taken to get anywhere. And I'd say every 10 years or so, there's a cycle, a news cycle, where this becomes the big news of the month or even 2 months. You know, we saw the Boston and Spotlight. That was like 16 years ago. Prior to that, in the early 90s, we had a big wave of coverage. Now we're getting another wave of coverage, and yet what has really changed?
Again, it does not seem like that much has changed, and I think that's partly because of the power structure of the church. You know, and I think it's probably safe to say that we've only been hearing about it for the last maybe 50, 60, 70 years, but it's probably been going on since forever.
Yeah, we weren't really hearing about it 60 years ago. It was happening, but there wasn't really any coverage at all. Now, you wrote a very, very good blog, It's Time to Quit the Catholic Church, up on the Patheos Free Thought Now website. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So that plays on FFRF's New York Times ad that you wrote back that was in 2012, I believe, which really took the Catholic Church to task and became sort of the byline for FFRF, It's Time to Quit the Catholic Church. And I used that and kind of ran with it in the blog. And
if you look at that New York Times ad, they made us add, it's time to consider quitting the Catholic Church. I think this one ran in, maybe it was the Washington Post. And we are looking at another ad. That particular ad was directed at Pope Benedict, so it was going after everything that's wrong with the Catholic Church, because, of course, he was very reactionary. It mentioned the pedophilia scandal that is without end. But it's time, again, to focus just on that with the Church, because Pope Francis, of course, has sort of whitewashed the image of the Church, and yet look at all the scandals that he has been involved in regarding cover-up or excusing this kind of predatory behavior.
Yeah, in my mind, this
year.
pope is all talk, right? I mean, he talks a great game. He's good at the PR side of things in ways that the popes have not been previously, but that's all he's done. I mean, in response to this, he said, fasting and prayer, that's the solution.
Oh, and then he's acted like, oh, I'm so horrified that this is happening. Well, he's in charge of this organization. And I think you've made some point about what if this was a corporation, for example. Do you want to?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the points in my article for Patheos was that I think if you are a Catholic now, there is no excuse. You don't have any ability to say, I am not complicit in this. You are officially now complicit in the rape of children and cover-up if you are a Catholic still. We know this is going to continue happening. As you mentioned, there's this cycle, and we see it every few years. It comes up again, and everybody's horrified, and then it happens again, and then it happens again, and then it happens again. Whereas if this were a secular organization or a university, a corporation, it would be shut down immediately if we continue to see these repeated cycles of abuse and cover-up. I mean, it happened once at Penn State, and it was a terrible cover-up. There was terrible allegations and confirmations of sexual assault there, but they immediately fixed it, and the NCAA handed down a very harsh penalty on Penn State. And if Penn State were to do that again, and then a couple of years later, and then again, it would be shut down. And there would be no claims of religious liberty or that this is the wrong thing to do. Anybody who donated to Penn State would be castigated. Anybody who considered them, or even considered going there, would be hung out to dry in the media, and they should be.
Well, I would also point out that the this open letter that ran in the New York Times originally, the kicker said it was addressed to nominal and liberal Catholics. Why haven't you quit the Catholic Church? In Ireland, for example, the people have walked away en masse. In this country, no, not so much. And we are still seeing the excuses being made, and including here in Madison, Wisconsin, where this is being filmed, a disgusting letter by Bishop Morlino that was read in a lot of Catholic churches this weekend. And you also wrote an op-ed that was published in the Capital Times. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. So Bishop Morlino's letter basically, the solution to the scandal for him was blame the gays. He said that this is the fault of homosexuality in the church, and blamed our LGBTQ brothers and sisters, saying that they're deviant, some nonsense about living an immoral lifestyle, and made it seem like homosexuality was a problem, and that was the root of this evil in the church, which is, I mean, it's fundamentally not true. The idea that homosexuality is the same as pedophilia has been debunked many, many times.
Now, we do see more same-sex pedophilia in the Catholic Church than we tend to see in the Protestant. But that would be like saying if there was a Protestant minister who preyed on a girl, let's blame heterosexuality.
Exactly. It's nonsense.
It's a deviant criminal sexual act preying on the most innocent, the most vulnerable population. It's a crime of power. So but we have seen this for years and years. This is how the Catholic Church has circled the wagon. It has tried to blame gays or homosexuality on its own priest problem, and it's really despicable. And
really, I think the central problem is the church itself. This is a church that teaches blind obedience. In Catholic canon law, it says that you have to give a religious submission of the intellect and will to whatever the Pope says. These Catholics have been trained since birth to listen to their priest as he's God in the flesh.
He's God in the flesh. He's the man of God. The kind of things you hear people say is, I thought he was God. Children feel and minors feel they have to do exactly what the priest says. When they've come forward and tried to tell parents in the past, they were often not believed.
Yeah, the parents don't believe the children.
Or their children thought they would not believe because it's so bizarre. We were working with Barbara Blaine last year, who was the co-founder of SNAP, and her story was so pathetic. She was groomed by a priest at her junior high school who was preying on her, and then he said, you've committed a sin and you can't take confession until you get absolution, but you can't go to any priests in this small community because that will out me. She was getting on her bicycle and bicycling on the highways to go to small towns outside her small town to get absolution for her sin. That's the kind of thing that has gone on with these cases.
And the problem is inherent in the power structure of the church. And it's not, the problem is going to continue to exist. We're going to continue to see these cycles until the Catholic Church changes its power structure, which is never going to happen. So the only option is, if you are a Catholic, it's time to quit the Catholic Church.
It is time to quit the Catholic Church, and we, as we said in the ad, quit en masse. You're better than the Catholic Church, and anybody who calls themselves a liberal Catholic or a Catholic is now propping up this corrupt institution that has raped and preyed upon children, also done some other things. There's also predatory conduct toward women, adult women, and so on. That's a slightly different issue, but it's there too.
I mean, disabled kids as well. You know, there's a story in the report about a 21-year-old with Down syndrome in the hospital being raped by a priest. I think you mentioned in your book a priest who was assigned to be a chaplain in a children's ward at a hospital who had been found.
Yes, like a boy whose foot was in traction.
Double traction.
There was, in this report, there was somebody who was preyed on right after she had an appendectomy, correct? I mean, you are talking about the ultimate abuse of power. Let's find somebody who's vulnerable and go after them. And I wondered if you could elucidate a little bit about this token that children were being given in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, so this shows up in the report, and there was a group of priests in one of the dioceses that were actually giving gold crosses to children who were particularly pliable victims, who were quiet and less able to defend themselves. And the grand jury actually interviewed one of the victims who still had that cross. And so they literally used this to mark people that the other priests could go out and then assault and rape. It's just, I mean,
and this
the
is a
details are
well-known
heartbreaking.
modus operandi among pedophiles to go after children who are already broken, basically. Do we have any questions?
We have a lot of questions rolling in. Ellen Maxwell Winters asks, why aren't all state AGs not investigating the Catholic Church?
Very good question.
Excellent question.
Now, 2 of the counties in Pennsylvania had done their own inquiries. That's why in Pennsylvania there were only 6 of the 8 counties in this particular report. I don't quite know why Pennsylvania has moved forward, do you?
Because they started with one diocese, and then they realized that the problem was not limited to that area, and that it was ridiculous to try to limit it to one geographical area. And this is one of the things that we are actually asking people to do, is to push your Attorney General to launch one of these investigations. This is not a Pennsylvania problem. It's not a problem in Boston. This is wherever the Catholic Church is, this is a problem.
And you could be looking for action alerts that FFRF will be prodding you so that you'll know how to contact your Attorney General in the future, because this has got to be done.
It absolutely has to be done. So we have another question from Nina Urez. Are there no arrests because the statute of limitations has run out?
Well, there are some arrests.
There are a couple of, there was actually, of the 301, I believe there was 2 arrests. Many of these priests have died. This report actually goes back, I think the earliest abuse documented was just shy of 70 years in this report. But only 2 indicted and arrested because of the statutes of limitations. And the statute of limitations is very, very short for sexual assault and abuse, and often in Pennsylvania, and often
and in many states.
Well beyond when these children even realize that they've been assaulted in this way, in a way that, as that one victim said, you know, it kills who they were or could have been. It kills their potential. But that's one of the other things that we're asking people to do.
In Pennsylvania, we've already sent out an action alert asking you, if you're in Pennsylvania, to contact your legislators, because there is litigation, including a very interesting bill that would do a two-year window just for the victims that were named in this report who were involved in this kind of crime.
So there's basically 2 fixes to that. There's one, you can amend the law to extend the statute of limitations for these kinds of cases, and then because you can't just that usually doesn't apply retroactively. You would have a 2-year window for any victim to step forward and then not have the statute of limitations apply to them.
And of course, SNAP has been lobbying for this for years. Marcy Hamilton and Child have been lobbying for this. So it isn't just the Catholic Church that's the problem. They are lobbying at the state houses, often majority Catholic legislators, such as in Wisconsin, and they're not getting these bills passed. So it's also a state church issue.
It is, and I mean a good example of that is there was these are called Child Victims Acts, where you're trying to extend the statutes of limitations. And in New York State, for instance, the Catholic Conference of Bishops there spent $2 million lobbying against a Child Victims Act, because why would you want these kids to be able to get justice?
So of course that shows their hand.
It does. Absolutely.
I mean, what could be clearer that they don't care about the children, and they care only about self-protection?
And Bill Donahue of the Catholic League, of course, said that that bill was an attempt to rape the Catholic Church, which I thought was the gall of that statement was unbelievable. So Callie Keith asks, do you think the Pope should have reacted differently to these crimes? Do you think that getting rid of the celibacy vow would help?
Well, those are two questions.
Two questions. Well,
let's talk about the celibate first.
Okay.
I would argue that when people blame celibacy for this, that's not correct.
I agree.
There are a lot of people who are celibate who don't go around raping children. But I think that the fact that it provides a cover, nobody's going to say, how come this priest is, or how come this minister isn't married, or how come this minister doesn't have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, whatever denomination you're in. Why don't they have a family? It's a perfect setup to attract that kind of pedophile. So in that respect, celibacy is very harmful. In the aspect of scapegoating women, celibacy in the Catholic Church is misogynistic. Like, you have to stay away from women. Women are sinful. So I'm not endorsing it, but it is not why someone goes out and attacks a child. That is a very, I think, ignorant, and I understand it's a natural reaction, and we're seeing this in a lot of letters by Catholics saying, let's get rid of the celibacy. I would say, yes, get rid of the celibacy for many reasons, but it's not the reason why you have crimes against children.
Yeah, it won't
It's a
fix
cover.
it. Yeah, people don't have so much pent-up energy that all of a sudden, sexual energy, that all of a sudden they go out and attack a kid. That's just not the way it works.
Well,
But
not normal people.
I think you're right on the money on both those points. But what about the second point, first question? Do you think the Pope should have reacted differently to these crimes?
Is the Pope Catholic? Would be my answer. Of course. And now he's going to Ireland, and he's going to go and listen. Well, I think he's going to get an earful in Ireland because they're not forgiving him. He should be taking down all the bishops who are involved in this. You know, he asked for the resignations of bishops in Chile, but he was the guy who made the mistake about making one of them a bishop against the advice of the other bishops. I mean, he's blaming other people for his own mistakes here. He's in charge of the church. He needs to do something about this, not just throw up his hands and say, oh, isn't this terrible? He's responsible. And
he's powerful. He has supreme power in this church. He can do whatever he wants. I mean, we could think of probably 10 things off the top of our heads right now that he could do that would make this instantly considerably better. I mean, one, tell Catholics it's their duty to report any of this abuse immediately to the secular authorities. That would start to change things.
Not just the church.
Yeah, tell all Catholics it's their duty to advocate for extensions of the statutes of limitations.
Right.
Tell all Catholics it's their duty to advocate for a change to the RICO law. Excommunicate all Catholics who are guilty of this instead of just defrogging them and asking them to resign.
Giving them some of them have been given a nice position at the Vatican.
Yeah, there's one there right now. So yes, the Pope can do a lot more, and he should. It's ridiculous that he doesn't. He's all talk. So Eric Horrenda asks, sorry Eric, that's probably not how you say your name. Do these priests honestly believe that if they ask for forgiveness after committing these crimes, that they will still be able to go to heaven?
Well, that is the Catholic theology, of course.
And the theology is a big part of this. You know, if you read the report, these predators use the theology to keep their victims silent. You know, they often use the threat of hell, saying, you know, if you report this, you are going to burn in eternal fire. There's one heart-wrenching story about a child who's worried about his mother who was unable to attend Mass, and goes to plead his case to the priest, saying, you know, she can't come, she's unable to, I'm worried that she's going to burn in hell. And the priest takes advantage of that and rapes the kid and then uses the threat of hell and his mother burning in hell to keep him quiet. It's disgusting.
There are many, through the years, many cases. I remember one, I think that it's in Betrayal of Trust, where the mother who was disabled would go in and clean the church for this priest every week. And while she was doing that, the priest was molesting the daughter. I mean, you name it, it's happened. I did a lot of reading about the psychology of pedophilia when I worked on this book, Betrayal of Trust. And I think that what people don't realize is that, you know, they are completely self-justifying these crimes. They don't consider them to be crimes. They're loving up the child. The child is giving them messages. It's a very sick, obviously, crime that they're doing. Mm-hmm. So they're not going to worry so much about forgiveness. It's very unusual to get any kind of apology or acknowledgement from them, even when they're being sentenced, about what they've done to the children or minors. So don't expect a whole lot of confessions out of these guys.
Now, Brittany Lewis asks, what has been the response to your call to quit the Catholic Church? Do you think it has been positive, or has there been a lot of blowback? Some people stay in the church because it provides people with a sense of community after all.
Well, I think you could find a nicer community if that's what you have to give up, that you're dealing with a church that gives sanctuary to perverts, blames gays, blames the victims. One thing that has changed a great deal, I'd say, in the last 30 years with all the news coverage is less blaming of the victims by congregations. We see so many of the children and minors being blamed by members of the congregations, often because they wouldn't believe them. I think they're more careful. I think there's less of that blame the victim philosophy, but they were, you know, being victimized doubly. They're being victimized by the priests, and then when they would come forward by their Catholic community. In terms of the ad that we did in 2012, It's Time to Quit the Catholic Church, there has still been some internet blowback on that as recently as, you know, a couple months ago. It hasn't kind of quit. Bill Donahue, of course, really attacked it. It got a lot of coverage. And I think it was a very important statement, and we'll see what happens when we continue it. But you know, I think that our challenge is really to American Catholics. What are you doing supporting this church? Why are you going to this church? How can you continue to go to this church? Let's look at what they're doing in Ireland, where maybe a smaller country where people actually knew the priest and knew the victims, and they're not putting up with the Catholic Church. You know, this country has excused it.
It has, unfortunately, and that's one of the points that I continue to make, is that American Catholics, at this point, you are complicit in these crimes. We've gotten a little bit of blowback on that, but I think it's a valid point right now. I mean, because we know this is happening, and we know it's going to happen again. I mean, they have a 7-stage playbook for how to cover these things up. It is
grand
deliberate.
Jury. That's right. I mean, they did a phenomenal job.
They did.
Was it 18 months of this? It was a huge study. How can anybody look at this and not feel that if they're Catholic, they should walk away?
And just one note real quick on Catholic demographics in the United States. The Catholic percentage of the population is hovering around 22-23% and has been for a number of years, but actually it's only staying at that level because of immigration. We're getting a lot of Latinos immigrating that are Catholic. If you look at white Catholics, that number has actually declined pretty significantly.
And I would point out, Andrew, that the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, as opposed to the N-U-N-S, we are actually more than Catholics at 23 point, is it 7%?
Yeah, almost 20.
So for the, you know, when you look at the largest denomination has always been Catholic. Now the largest denomination is those of us without any religion. So that's very nice.
It is.
Do we have any other questions?
We do. We have one from John Ramirez. What can non-Catholics do to help and support the victims of these crimes? So that's an excellent question.
Well, I think contacting state AGs about why aren't they doing the same kind of study, joining the Freedom from Religion Foundation and other secular groups working for separation of church and state, I guess we'll have to see what some of the groups like SNAP are doing as a result of this.
There are a couple rallies that we're going to make people aware of in Pennsylvania. There are a few state legislators who are blocking these child victims acts, so you can attend rallies and keep your eyes open for things like that. You really ought to sign up for FFRF's action alerts if you want to learn more about that. That's a big thing that people can do, and I think really you ought to ask any Catholic you meet, why are you still supporting this organization?
How can you? No, I think that we have a quote from Martin Buber. If maybe you can read that, Andrew.
Oh, sure. Since the primary motive of evil is disguise, one of the places evil people are most likely to be found is within the church. What better way to conceal one's evil from oneself, as well as from others, than to be a deacon or some other highly visible form of Christian within our culture? I do not mean to imply that the evil are anything other than a small minority among the religious, or that the religious motives of most people are in any way spurious. I mean only that evil people tend to gravitate toward piety for the disguise and concealment it can offer them.
And that's Martin Buber. That's the prologue to my book, Betrayal of Trust, which, by the way, is available online. It's dated, but the background information is not. I mean, it gives many examples from the 80s. You can find that at ffrf.org. Go to our publications link, and then go to the books, and it's one of the online books.
And like we said, it keeps happening over and over again, so it's still going to be timely to a certain extent. And we do have one more question, and I think we have to take it because it's from a guy named Dan Barker. Do you know him?
Oh, yeah.
Is Pennsylvania representative of other states? If so, can we extrapolate the national and international scope of the problem?
Well, I think so, yes. I mean, we'd have to see without doing the math right here. I can't do it right here. Pennsylvania is a very highly populated state, I would say, isn't it? But yes, it's a trail of devastation. And they even said in the grand jury, there are thousands more. We just weren't able. Some people don't come forward.
Thousands more victims, yeah.
Thousands more victims. People don't come forward. They're afraid. They're dead.
Well, you said 185 dioceses in the country, and so if there's 6, that's about. I mean, you're talking about 300 predator priests, and that's like 9,000 predator priests in the United States.
At least.
You're talking, 30,000 victims. But again,
I think more than that.
Again, far more than that, because the report indicated the report said thousands more.
Of pedophiles back in the 80s, the studies were showing that the average pedophile had 50 victims. Now that's not priest. We're just talking in general. And I should say, often pedophiles will gravitate towards something like coach or pediatrician or volunteer with children. Obviously, most people who have these professions are not pedophiles, but they will gravitate to something that gives them access to children.
There was an example of that in the report. Actually the priest who beat the child with the metal cross that I mentioned at the beginning, he left the church. They pushed him out, but they gave him a letter of recommendation so that he could go work at Walt Disney World.
Yeah. So we don't really know. I think there'll be a lot more news articles asking this question that we'll be able to look toward. I know that the United Nations is still being pushed. They have asked for many actions by the Vatican that they have not taken yet, and they're meeting again this summer. So there may be some more movement there.
Well, that's great. So that's actually going to do it for today's episode of Ask an Atheist. Now, we already left you with that wonderful insight by Martin Buber. But before we go, we do want to mention 2 quick things. First is our upcoming convention in San Francisco this year. This is November 2nd through the 4th. And Annie Laurie, can you tell us about some of the speakers?
Yeah, we have many speakers and honorees, including Salman Rushdie, who's getting the Emperor Has No Clothes Award, Cecile Richards of Planned Parenthood, Adam Savage from Mythbusters, the actor John Delancey, I guess he's on the screen there, of Star Trek fame. We have the co-founder of Ex-Muslims of North America, Sarah Hayter, comedians Leanne Lord, Julia Sweeney, and many others. Ansaf Hadar, whose husband is Raif Badawi, who's been in the news. He's the Egyptian imprisoned, and his sister was just arrested there, in Saudi Arabia. And we'll also be doing the first annual Avajit Roy Courage Award, and Rafida Bona Ahmed, whose husband was hacked to death in 2015 in Bangladesh, will be there to give that first Courage Award. So it'll be very diverse. There'll be comedy, and there'll be some very serious topics, and I don't think you'll want to miss it. Rooms are almost gone, so don't dilly-dally. Go to ffrf.org/convention 2018. You can find a link to make your reservations. This is San Francisco at the Hyatt Embarcadero. It's going to be a great time.
And also, if you'd like to take action and figure out how you can actually take on the Catholic Church, not just in your area, but anywhere, you should sign up to receive FFRF text alerts on your smartphone by texting FFRF to 52886. Data rates may apply. Again, that's FFRF to 52886. And these shows will go up on YouTube afterward, so pass the word along to your friends. And we will have plenty more shows available this year and previous shows. So thank you for joining us on this week's episode of FFRF's Ask an Atheist.